My name is Savanna, and I am 28 years old. 14 months ago, I stood on a cliffside in Monterey, California, wearing a lace wedding gown that cost me 4 months of overtime pay. I was surrounded by the scent of salt air and the sound of crashing waves, but all I could focus on were the two empty chairs in the front row. My parents, Harold and Patricia, had sent a generic 99-cent card 3 days prior, claiming that a flight from Georgia was simply too far to travel. They sent no gift and made no phone call. I spent my wedding night wondering if I was truly that easy to forget. But 10 minutes after I said I do, I saw my sister Kimberly's Instagram story. There they were back in Savannah, Georgia, laughing over a neighborhood barbecue under a sun-drenched oak tree. They weren't too tired or too busy. They just didn't want to be there for me. Since that day, I have been a ghost to them. I went no contact and changed my number. Then last week, my mother sent a text to my work email as if the last year of silence never happened. She didn't ask how I was. She didn't apologize for the empty chairs. She simply said, "We are celebrating our 30th anniversary, and since you are an event planner, we have decided you will organize the dinner. It needs to be spectacular." I read that message 4 times before I put my phone down and realized that to them, I am not a daughter. I am just free labor. Before we go further into how I handled this, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Hazel Tells Stories. We only want you here if these stories of standing up for yourself truly resonate with your heart. Also, I would love to know how old you are and what time it is where you are watching from. Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. Now let me take you back to that afternoon in Monterey, and the moment I realized that the people who raised me had officially traded my heart for a social media post. The wind was whipping my veil against my face when the officiant asked who gave this woman away. My husband Marcus took my hand and squeezed it because he knew the answer was nobody. The silence of those two empty chairs felt like a physical weight. I had spent 20 years being the sturdy daughter, the one who didn't need the SAT tutors or the brand new SUV my sister Kimberly got the day she turned 16. I was the one who worked shifts at a diner to pay for my own textbooks while my parents bragged to the neighbors about Kimberly's high-end social life. My wedding was supposed to be the one day where I came first. But as the sun set over the Pacific, I realized the southern appearances my parents worshipped were a wall I would never be able to climb. I checked my phone during the reception, hoping for a last-minute text, a crumb of parental love. Instead, I saw the photo of the backyard barbecue in Georgia. My father was holding a beer, leaning against his grill, looking perfectly comfortable 2,500 miles away from his oldest daughter's milestone. My sister Kimberly had captioned it, "The real Dixon crew together at last." The word real felt like a slap. It was a clear message that I was an outsider, a guest who had been uninvited from her own bloodline. That night I made a choice. I didn't cry. I just turned my phone off and started building a life where those chairs would never be empty again. I became a ghost in Georgia, but in San Francisco, I became a force to be reckoned with. I built a premier event planning firm, from nothing, catering to clients who actually value excellence. I thought the silence was my protection, until that email arrived proving that my parents' audacity knows no borders. The barbecue photo on Kimberly's feed stayed burned into my retinas long after I locked my phone. It was the ultimate proof of a hierarchy I had spent 28 years trying to ignore. To understand why a single text message 14 months later felt like an insult, you have to understand the specific brand of neglect that defines the Dixon household. My parents, Harold and Patricia, are masters of the southern facade. In our suburb of Savannah, the lawn is always manicured to within an inch of its life, and the church pews are occupied every Sunday morning without fail. But inside that white colonial house, love was a currency that only Kimberly knew how to spend. My sister is 3 years younger than me, and from the moment she was born, she was the family project. She was the delicate one, the one who needed the pageant coaches and the expensive private tutors. I was simply the sturdy one. That was the label they slapped on me like a shipping manifest. Savanna is sturdy, my mother would say to the neighbors while Kimberly preened in her latest cheerleading uniform. Savanna doesn't need much. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because they decided I didn't need anything, they stopped giving me everything. The contrast became a permanent fixture of our lives, a jagged line running through my adolescence. On Kimberly's 16th birthday, my father led her to the driveway with a silk blindfold over her eyes. He revealed a brand new white SUV with a massive red bow on the hood, while the neighbors clapped and Patricia filmed the whole thing for Facebook. That same month, I was working double shifts at a local diner and a second job at the public library just to cover the cost of my AP exam fees and college textbooks. When I asked my father if he could help with my tuition deposit, he didn't even look up from the bank statements he was reviewing to fund Kimberly's elite dance camp. He just sighed and told me that I was so independent and capable that it would be a shame to stifle my growth by making things too easy. He said it with a smile that suggested he was doing me a favor by letting me struggle. That was the DNA of my upbringing. Every achievement I earned was met with a nod of expectation, while every minor drama Kimberly experienced was treated like a national emergency. I learned to celebrate my wins in the dark, because my light apparently threatened to dim the spotlight they kept trained on my sister. This dynamic created a secondary conflict that simmered beneath the surface for years. It wasn't just that they ignored me, it was that they expected me to be the audience for Kimberly's life. I was the one tasked with recording her recitals, the one who stayed behind to clean up after her elaborate graduation parties, and the one who was told to move my 10-year-old Honda Civic to the street, because Kimberly's SUV needed the prime spot in the driveway. "Guests notice what is in the driveway first," my mother would hiss, her eyes darting to the neighbors' houses. She cared more about the opinion of a woman 3 doors down than she did about the fact that I was exhausted from working through the night. I became an architect of my own survival, building a wall of professional competence to hide the hollow ache where a family should have been. I realized early on that if I wanted a seat at any table, I would have to build the table myself. By the time I left for California, the resentment had crystallized into a cold, hard ambition. I didn't move across the country just for the weather. I moved to escape the gravitational pull of a family that only saw me as a supporting character in Kimberly's long-running show. My success in San Francisco wasn't fueled by a desire for wealth, but by a desperate need to be undeniable. I wanted to reach a level of excellence where they couldn't claim I was just lucky or sturdy. I wanted to be the person they had to call when they wanted something done right. But even as I rose through the ranks of the event-planning world, a part of me was still that girl at the diner counting quarters for a biology book. I thought that by becoming a ghost I had won the war. I thought that the 14 months of silence after my wedding meant they had finally accepted that I was gone. But that is the thing about people who view you as an asset instead of a human being. They don't see your absence as a loss of love. They see it as a temporary shortage of labor. When that text message finally arrived asking me to plan their 30th anniversary dinner, it wasn't a peace offering. It was an order. My mother's phrasing was precise. "We have decided you will organize the dinner." There was no request, no acknowledgement of the wedding chairs, no mention of the 14 months of dead air. It was a command based on the assumption that my time and my talent still belonged to them by right of birth. They didn't want to see me. They wanted to use me. And as I sat in my office in San Francisco, looking at the invitation for a 30th anniversary that celebrated a marriage built on the backs of my overlooked childhood, I realized that the conflict hadn't ended when I moved away. It had just been waiting for a bigger stage. My parents still believed I was the sturdy one who would fold under the pressure of a family obligation. They believed I was still the girl who would move her car to the street without a word. They were about to find out that while they were busy molding Kimberly into a socialite, they had accidentally built a daughter who knew exactly how to dismantle a facade brick by brick. The immediate tension shifted from the past to the very near future. If I ignored the text, I remained the villain in their story, the ungrateful daughter who abandoned her parents during their milestone year. If I accepted, I was back in the cycle of unpaid service. But as I stared at the message, a new conflict began to take shape in my mind. Kimberly was still in Savanna, still the golden child, still the focus of every penny they had left. Why were they coming to me now? Why was the sturdy daughter suddenly needed for a spectacular event when they had spent 30 years acting like my presence was optional? I realized then that Harold and Patricia weren't just looking for free help. They were looking for a rescue, and the price of that rescue was going to be much higher than any of them could ever imagine. I put my phone down not to ignore them, but to begin the process of professional discovery. If they wanted a spectacular show, I was going to give them one. But the script was going to be written in my handwriting this time, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to be the one cleaning up when the curtains closed. I was going to be the one holding the bill. 14 months of silence is a long time when you are waiting for a heartbeat, but it passes in the blink of an eye when you are building an empire. After the Monterey cliffside wedding, I didn't just block their numbers. I surgically removed the Georgia version of Savanna Dixon and buried her under the weight of sheer, unadulterated ambition. I stayed in San Francisco, a city that doesn't care about Southern pedigree or who got the biggest SUV in high school. I traded the humid air of Savannah for the crisp, professional chill of the Bay Area. I didn't just find a job, I built Porter Events. Within a year, my name was the one whispered in the hallways of tech giants and nonprofit galas when someone needed a miracle performed in 72 hours. I became the woman who could orchestrate a 1,000-person dinner without breaking a sweat, the one who saw every logistical nightmare before it happened. I was successful, I was busy, and for the first time in my life, I was entirely self-defined. Marcus and I built a home filled with light and respect, a stark contrast to the white colonial house where I was treated like a temporary guest. The silence from Georgia was absolute. No birthday calls, no check-ins during the holidays, not even a passive-aggressive Facebook comment from Kimberly. I had effectively become an only child in my own mind, and I assumed they had done the same. I thought the empty chairs in Monterey were the final period at the end of a very long, very painful sentence. But then came the Tuesday afternoon that shattered the peace. I was in the middle of a walkthrough for a Silicon Valley product launch when my work phone buzzed. It was an email notification forwarded from my old personal account that I rarely checked. The sender was Patricia Dixon. My heart didn't race. It didn't even skip a beat. It just felt like a cold stone dropping into a deep well. I stepped away from the catering team and opened the message. The text was brief, typed with the kind of casual entitlement that only a mother who has never been told no can possess. It read, "We are celebrating our 30th anniversary next month. Since you are so good at planning, we have decided you will handle the dinner in Savannah. It needs to be spectacular. Your father wants the best of everything. We expect you home by the 15th to start the site visits." I read it once, then twice. By the fourth time, the words began to blur, but the intent was crystal clear. There was no mention of the 14 months of dead air, no apology for the wedding they skipped, no question about whether I was even available or if I wanted to see them. It was a summons issued to a servant, not an invitation sent to a daughter. They didn't want to reconcile. They wanted a high-end event planner for the price of a daughter's guilt. The audaciousness of the request was a new kind of conflict, one that bypassed my sadness and went straight to a sharp clinical fury. They weren't asking for my time. They were demanding my professional expertise, a commodity I spent years perfecting, and they expected it for free. In their minds, my success wasn't something I had earned. It was a resource they were entitled to harvest whenever they saw fit. Patricia didn't ask what my fees were. She didn't ask if Marcus was coming. She simply assumed that the sturdy daughter would drop her life in California, fly across the country, and spend tens of thousands of her own professional capital to celebrate a marriage that had consistently marginalized her. As I stood in that high-tech event space surrounded by people who paid me $300 an hour for my advice, the irony was almost deafening. My parents were effectively asking me to plan a monument to their own success, using the very skills I developed to survive their neglect. The spectacular dinner they wanted was meant to show the neighbors in Savannah that the Dixon family was still the gold standard. They wanted me to paint the scenery for a play I wasn't even cast in. I realized then that my mother's text wasn't a lapse in judgment. It was a calculated move. She knew exactly what I did for a living now. She had likely been tracking my firm's Instagram, not to be proud, but to price out what she could get for nothing. A new, more dangerous tension began to coil in my chest. If I ignored her, she would tell the entire family I was elitist and cold, a daughter who became too big for her boots and refused to help her parents celebrate a milestone. She would weaponize my success against me, turning my professional standing into a sign of my moral failing. But if I replied I was opening a door I had spent over a year boarding up. I looked at the catering manager waiting for my approval on the menu and then back at the screen of my phone. The sharp clarity I felt wasn't about whether to help them. It was about how to respond in a way that would finally irrevocably change the rules of the game. I started thinking about Kimberly. If I was the one planning the spectacular dinner, where was the golden child in all of this? Why wasn't the daughter they stayed home for the one handling the arrangements? A suspicion began to form, a dark thread of logic that suggested things in the white colonial house weren't as perfect as the lawn made them seem. If they were reaching out to the daughter they had discarded, it meant the daughter they kept was failing. I felt a surge of curiosity mixed with a newfound sense of power. They had handed me a seat at their table because they needed my hands to set it. They didn't realize that I was no longer the girl who worked for scraps of affection. I was a businesswoman who understood the value of a contract. The conflict moved from the screen of my phone to the core of my identity. For 14 months, I thought my value was tied to how well I could hide from them. Now I realized my true value was in how well I could stand in front of them and charge them for the view. I didn't reply immediately. I let the silence stretch for another 24 hours, knowing that every hour that passed was a minute of rising panic for Patricia. She was used to me jumping at the first sign of a family need. She was about to find out that in California, we don't start working until the terms are negotiated. As I sat in my home that night with Marcus, I showed him the message. He didn't tell me to ignore it. He knew me better than that. He saw the look in my eyes, the same one I get when a vendor tries to overcharge a client. He knew I wasn't going to Savanna to be a daughter. I was going to Savanna to be a reckoning. But as I began to draft my response, a second text arrived. This one wasn't from my mother. It was from Kimberly. It was a single line that sent a chill through my professional composure. Savanna, don't you dare come back here and ruin this for me. I need this party to go perfectly, or I am finished. I stared at the screen, the conflict suddenly multiplying. It wasn't just a 30th anniversary. It was a cover-up. And my sister, the one who had been the real Dixon for 25 years, was terrified that the ghost from California was about to haunt her house of cards. The game had officially changed. I wasn't just being asked to plan a party. I was being invited into a crime scene, and I was the only one who knew how to find the evidence. I stared at Kimberly's frantic text message for a long time, the blue bubble glowing like a warning flare on my screen. Don't you dare come back here and ruin this for me. It was the first time she had initiated contact in over a year, and it wasn't a hello or a sisterly inquiry. It was a threat wrapped in desperation. I was about to type a response, something sharp and final, when my phone buzzed again. This time it wasn't a direct message. It was a notification that I had been added to a group chat. The title of the group made my stomach turn, The Real Dixons. In their haste to organize the logistics of their 30-year victory lap, Kimberly had made a tactical error. She had added my old phone number, the one I kept active only for banking and legacy accounts, thinking she was adding a local caterer with a similar area code. For the next 20 minutes, I sat in my quiet San Francisco office and watched the soul of my family lay itself bare in digital ink. I didn't participate. I didn't reveal my presence. I simply bore witness to the free help strategy as it was being drafted in real time. My father's messages were the first to cut through. He was complaining about the quotes he'd received from local Savanna planners. These people are thieves, Harold wrote. They want a 15% management fee just to pick out napkins and book a band. I'm not paying some stranger $50,000 to tell me how to celebrate my own marriage. Then my mother chimed in, her tone as soothing and manipulative as I remembered. That's why we sent the text to Savanna, Patricia typed. She's been doing this in California for people with way too much money. She'll jump at the chance to handle this for us. It's her way back in. She's been pouting for 14 months because we missed that wedding, but she's the sturdy one. She'll fold once she realizes we're offering her a seat at the table again. The conflict shifted from a simple lack of love to a calculated financial exploitation. They weren't just ignoring my professional value. They were actively planning to weaponize my desire for their approval to balance their own books. But it was my father's next message that truly made my blood turn cold. Savanna will do the labor for free just to get back in our good graces, he wrote. If she handles the logistics and uses her corporate discounts, we can take that $50,000 we saved and put it toward the down payment on Kimberly's new apartment in Midtown. We'll tell Savanna it's a tight budget year, so she doesn't get any grand ideas about being reimbursed. I felt a roar of clarity. This wasn't a family reunion. It was a heist. They were planning to steal my time, my expertise, and my industry connections to subsidize my sister's lifestyle yet again. It was the white SUV all over Agen, but this time I was being asked to build the garage it sat in. Kimberly's response in the chat was a string of heart emojis. Thanks, Daddy, she wrote. I really need that place. Savanna won't mind. She's always been the one who takes care of things. She's probably just happy we're talking to her again. This realization added a new jagged layer to the conflict. I wasn't being invited back as a daughter who had been missed. I was being recruited as a cost-saving measure. They had appraised my worth and decided it was exactly equal to the amount of money they could avoid paying a professional. I thought back to the nights I spent in the library working through the exhaustion to build my business and compared it to the casual way they discussed harvesting my life's work. The real Dixons were a closed circle, and I was just the engine they wanted to hook up to their broken wagon to get it moving again. A brief flash of my 22nd birthday hit me. I had just landed my first junior coordinator role, and I wanted to take the family to a nice steakhouse to celebrate. My mother told me it was too expensive and that we should just do a potluck at home. An hour later, I found out she had booked a $500 spa day for Kimberly because her favorite reality show had been canceled and she was feeling blue. The pattern hadn't changed, it had just scaled up. In Savanna, appearances cost money, and since they had spent all of theirs on the golden child, they expected the invisible daughter to provide the rest. I looked at Kimberly's separate threatening text, and then back at the group chat where she was playing the sweet, grateful daughter. The duplicity was breathtaking. She wanted the down payment, but she didn't want the person providing it to actually be present. She wanted the benefit of my labor without the inconvenience of my existence. It was a stronger, more dangerous conflict than anything I had faced before because it involved my professional reputation. If I did this job poorly, it would reflect on my firm. If I did it well, I was a martyr for a family that didn't love me. But as I sat there, the event planner in me took over. I knew how to handle difficult clients. I knew how to manage expectations. And most importantly, I knew how to draft a contract that was ironclad. I decided then that I wouldn't ignore the text. I wouldn't send a furious reply. I would accept the job, but I would do it under my own professional terms. I wouldn't be Savanna the daughter. I would be Savanna Porter, CEO of Porter Events. I opened my laptop and began drafting a formal proposal. I included my standard management fees, my vendor requirements, and a clause about family discounts that looked generous on paper, but was tied to specific milestones they would never be able to meet. I was going to give them the spectacular dinner they wanted, but I was going to treat them with the same detached, rigorous professionalism I gave to every other client who tried to lowball me. The immediate tension now centered on their reaction. When they received a formal contract instead of a grateful, "Yes, Mommy," the facade was going to crack. I was betting on their greed and their obsession with appearances. They wanted the San Francisco flair to impress the Savanna elite. They wanted the Dixon name associated with the kind of excellence I provided. I was going to give them exactly what they asked for, but for the first time in 28 years, I wasn't going to be the one paying the bill. I sent the email at 5 o'clock on a Friday, knowing they would spend the whole weekend stewing over it. I included a line at the bottom. As this is a professional engagement for Porter events, all communications must go through my office. I then left the group chat, but not before taking screenshots of every single message. I had the free help strategy documented. I had the proof that they were planning to use my wedding trauma as leverage. The conflict was no longer a private ache, it was a chess match. Kimberly's fear, my father's greed, and my mother's manipulation were all on the table. As I closed my office door and walked out into the cool San Francisco evening to meet Marcus for dinner, I felt a weight lift. I wasn't waiting for them to see me anymore. I was forcing them to look. And when they finally realized who they were dealing with, they would find that the sturdy daughter had been replaced by a woman who knew exactly how to charge for her time. The stage was set for the 30th anniversary, but the Dixon family was about to learn that when you hire a professional to plan your party, you don't get to dictate the ending of the story. I didn't call them. I didn't send a long emotional email detailing my hurt feelings or the betrayal of the group chat. Instead, I opened my laptop and pulled up the standard client onboarding template for Porter events. I filled in their names, Harold and Patricia Dixon, as the primary contacts. Under the section for services rendered, I listed a comprehensive management package: venue procurement, high-end catering coordination, floral design, and day of execution. Then I added the management fee. $50,000. It was exactly the amount my father had bragged about saving in the group chat. I attached my firm's standard 30-page contract, which includes clauses for late fees, behavioral expectations, and a strict non-refundable deposit. I sent it at precisely 5 o'clock on a Friday. The reaction was almost instantaneous. My mother called 3 times in a row, her name flashing on my screen like a desperate signal. I didn't answer. I waited until Monday morning to send a brief professional follow-up from my assistant's email account. At 10 a.m., my father finally managed to get through to my office line. "Savanna, what is this?" he demanded, his voice booming with the practiced authority of a man who spent 40 years running a manufacturing plant. "This little PDF you sent is a cute joke, but we need to get to work. Your mother already picked out a theme. We need you to fly down and start the bookings." He laughed, but it was a jagged sound, thin and forced. He was trying to frame my professionalism as a childish prank, a desperate bid for attention that he was graciously humoring. I didn't laugh back. I kept my voice low, steady, and clinical, the exact tone I use when a corporate client tries to dispute a line item on an invoice. "Mr. Dixon, Porter Events does not begin work without a signed contract and a cleared deposit," I said. My father went silent for a beat. "Did you just call me Mr. Dixon?" he hissed. I continued, as if I hadn't heard the hurt in his voice. "The terms in the document are non-negotiable. If you wish to utilize my firm's resources and industry connections, the deposit must be wired by the end of the business day." The tension crackled across the 3,000 miles of fiber optic cable between us. Harold was used to being the boss. In Savanna, he was a man of stature, a person who gave orders and expected them to be followed without question. To have his sturdy daughter, the one he'd spent a lifetime overlooking, treat him like a standard account was a fundamental insult to his ego. "You're being ridiculous, Savanna," he snapped. "We're your parents. We're not some strangers off the street. You don't charge family." I reminded him that they hadn't been family enough to attend my wedding 14 months ago, so I was struggling to see why I should provide a family discount now. The silence on the other end was deafening. I could practically hear his blood pressure rising, but I didn't flinch. I told him that if he wanted the San Francisco flair he'd been bragging about to his friends, he had to pay the San Francisco price. This created an immediate escalating conflict. My parents didn't have $50,000 sitting around. I knew this because I'd seen the chatter in the real Dixon's chat. They were leveraged to the hilt, pouring every spare cent into Kimberly's failing influencer lifestyle and her luxury apartment. By demanding a deposit, I wasn't just being professional, I was forcing them to choose. They had to decide if their public reputation at the anniversary party was worth more than the money they were hoarding for Kimberly. I was testing their willingness to finally invest in me, even if it was under the guise of a business transaction. An hour later, my mother called, her voice dripping with the honey-thick manipulation she used to get her way. "Savanna, honey, let's not be difficult," she cooed. "We're so proud of your little business, but surely you can see how hurtful this is. We just want to celebrate our love with our daughters. Why make it so cold?" I told her that cold was the temperature of the empty chairs at my wedding, and if she wanted warmth, she could pay for the premium heater rentals I'd listed in the proposal. She gasped, the sound of a woman who had realized her favorite tool guilt was no longer working. The drama intensified as Harold called back, this time screaming about loyalty. He accused me of being elitist, of letting my fancy California life turn me into a monster. I let him rant until he ran out of breath. Then I calmly explained that the deposit was for premium vendors who required immediate booking. In reality, I was holding the line. If they wanted my labor, they were going to have to acknowledge my value in the only language they truly understood: money. The conflict was no longer about a party. It was a battle for the power dynamic of our entire relationship. By Monday afternoon, a new layer of conflict emerged. Kimberly texted me privately, furious that I was bankrupting the family. "You know, they don't have that kind of cash up front," she wrote. "You're doing this on purpose to make them look bad." I replied with a single sentence: "If they can't afford the planner, they can't afford the party." I knew Kimberly was terrified. If that $50,000 went to my firm, it wouldn't go to her midtown apartment. The golden child was finally feeling the chill of the sturdy daughter's shadow. Suddenly the phone buzzed with a bank notification. The wire transfer had hit. $50,000 had been moved from Harold's retirement account to Porter Events. They had done it. They had sacrificed a portion of Kimberly's subsidy to buy my participation. But as I stared at the confirmation, I felt no triumph, only a deeper sense of foreboding. They hadn't paid because they loved me. They had paid because I had them backed into a corner. They wanted their spectacular show, and they were willing to pay to keep the Dixon facade from crumbling. The immediate conflict shifted. Now that I was officially hired, my mother assumed she could control me. She sent a follow-up email with a list of demands that would have cost double the budget we'd discussed. She wanted a specific ballroom at the most exclusive hotel in Savanna, and she wanted it on a Saturday night in peak season. I knew that ballroom was booked 2 years in advance. But I also knew the owner. I realized then that my parents didn't just want a planner, they wanted a magician to fix the mess they'd made of their lives. As I began the actual logistics, I uncovered a new jarring conflict. I contacted the hotel to check for cancellations, and the manager, a woman who had known my grandmother, dropped a bombshell. "Your parents already tried to book this 6 months ago. Savanna," she told me. "They put down a deposit with a different planner, but the check bounced. They're in deep trouble here." I sat back in my chair, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. They hadn't reached out to me because I was so good at planning. They reached out because I was the only person left in the industry who didn't know they were broke. My parents weren't just exploiting me, they were using my professional reputation to launder their financial failure. The free help strategy was a desperate attempt to save face before the town found out the Dixons were a house of cards. I looked at the $50,000 in my account. It wasn't just a fee anymore. It was the first payment in a very expensive education they were about to receive. The tension was no longer about the party. It was about how much longer they could hide the truth before I tore the curtain down myself. I sent a message to the group chat, knowing they were all watching. "Deposit received. We begin site visits on the 15th. Be prepared to sign the vendor contracts." I knew they couldn't sign them. I knew Kimberly was already looking for a way to steal that money back. The war had officially moved to the home front, and the next casualty was going to be the Dixon name itself. The $50,000 wire transfer was a cold confirmation that my parents were playing a high-stakes game of chicken with their own future. But as I began digging into the vendor contracts for the Savanna ballroom, I realized I wasn't the only one they were hiding things from. My sister Kimberly was the architect of her own disaster, and she was using our parents' desperation as her final safety net. To the outside world, Kimberly was still the polished socialite, the girl whose Instagram feed was a curated gallery of white wine brunches and boutique shopping trips. But in the professional circles, I moved in word travels fast. I had a colleague in fashion PR tell me over a casual drink that Kimberly had been blacklisted from 2 major agencies for non-payment and for claiming sponsorships that didn't exist. Her influencer career was a hollow shell, a house of cards built on maxed-out credit cards and the dwindling remains of my father's manufacturing pension. Kimberly viewed this 30th anniversary party as her terminal payout. She wasn't just there to celebrate a marriage, she was there to ensure that when Harold finally stepped down, every remaining cent was funneled into her midtown lifestyle before I could even ask about a fair inheritance. The conflict shifted from a battle for attention to a desperate scramble for survival. Kimberly knew that if I was the one holding the clipboard, I would eventually see the line items. She knew that as a professional event planner, I would notice that the family accounts were bleeding dry. Her response was a classic Dixon move. She decided to destroy my reputation before I could expose hers. The sabotage started with small poisonous whispers. I heard it first from my Aunt Janine, who called me on a Tuesday afternoon, sounding breathless and accusatory. "Savanna, is it true you're planning to use your parents' dinner to promote your own firm? Kimberly said you're only doing this to get photos for your portfolio and that you don't care about the family at all." I stayed calm, my professional mask firmly in place, but the fury was coiling in my chest. Kimberly was painting me as the opportunist, the cold California businesswoman who was exploiting her own parents' milestone for a marketing campaign. She was weaponizing the very success I had built to make me look like a villain in the eyes of everyone we had ever known. This created a new, exhausting layer of conflict. I wasn't just fighting a logistical war, I was fighting a war of reputation management within my own bloodline. Every time I reached out to a local vendor in Savanna, I could feel the hesitation on the other end of the line. Kimberly had been there first, dropping hints that I was difficult to work with, or that I might not pay the final balance. She was trying to choke off my resources so that the party would fail, and she could swoop in as the savior who tried to stop the mean sister from ruining everything. I remembered a summer when I was 19. I had worked 3 months of overtime to buy a used car so I could get to my night classes. Kimberly had told our parents I was using the car to go to parties I shouldn't be at, and they took my keys away for a month based on nothing but her word. She has always known that my parents' greatest weakness is their fear of what people think. By telling them I was planning to embarrass them at the anniversary, she was hitting the panic button on their most deeply held insecurity. Harold called me late that night, his voice thick with a mixture of fear and rage. "I'm hearing things, Savanna. I'm hearing that you're planning a spectacle that isn't about us. If you do anything to humiliate this family in front of the Harringtons or the mayor, I will pull the plug on this whole thing and you'll never see a dime of that deposit back." I realized then that my father's loyalty was a fickle thing, easily swayed by whichever daughter was currently whispering in his ear. He didn't trust the daughter who had actually provided the funds, he trusted the one who made him feel like a big man. The immediate tension moved from the bank account to the guest list. Kimberly started adding people to the digital invite list without my approval. Mostly her own creditors and a few minor local celebrities she was trying to impress. She wanted to turn my professional event into her personal networking gala. When I deleted the unauthorized guests, she went crying to Patricia, claiming I was being a gatekeeper and trying to isolate them from their real friends. The house of cards was shaking, and Kimberly was trying to pin the tremors on me. But the deeper conflict was the one Kimberly didn't see coming. While she was busy telling our parents I was a fraud, I was busy looking at the actual numbers. I realized that the $50,000 they had wired me was likely the very last of their liquid cash. If the party went forward as they planned, they would have nothing left for an emergency. Kimberly was so obsessed with her midtown apartment that she was willing to let our parents retire into poverty as long as she got her down payment. I felt a jarring sense of responsibility. Did I let them fall for the sake of the lesson, or did I intervene and prove Kimberly right about me being controlling? The drama reached a new height when Kimberly sent a mass email to the extended family, excluding me, of course. Aunt Janine forwarded it within minutes. It was a long, flowery message about how stressed she was trying to keep the party on track while Savanna was making impossible demands from California. She was setting the stage for my failure. If the party was great, she would claim she managed my difficult personality to make it happen. If it was a disaster, she would say she warned everyone I was out for revenge. I sat in my office and looked at the screenshots of the real Dixon's chat, then at Kimberly's public smear campaign. The conflict was no longer about a wedding I missed or an anniversary they wanted. It was about the truth of who we were. Kimberly was a parasite disguised as a socialite, and our parents were the willing hosts. I realized that the only way to win a war of reputation is to let the other person talk until they run out of breath. I didn't defend myself to Aunt Janine. I didn't send a counter email. I simply added a new line item to the budget for a professional videographer and a high-end private investigator I had used for corporate vetting in the past. If Kimberly wanted a spectacular show, I was going to give her one, but it wasn't going to be the one she was auditioning for. I was going to document every lie, every unauthorized guest, and every penny of my parents' money she was currently siphoning off. The immediate conflict now moved toward the site visit. I was due in Savanna in 3 days. I knew that the moment I stepped off that plane, the physical confrontation was going to begin. Kimberly had already told our parents she was going to be the one to pick me up from the airport to keep an eye on me. She didn't realize that I wasn't coming alone. I was bringing the full weight of my professional firm and a paper trail that led directly to her front door. The Dixon family was about to learn that the sturdy daughter didn't just plan parties, she audited them. And the golden child was about to find out what happens when the cards finally start to fall. The flight from San Francisco to Savannah felt like a journey through time, a transition from the life I had built to the ghost story I had left behind. I didn't head straight to the white colonial house with its manicured lawn and hollow promises. Instead, I took a taxi to a small, dignified office in the historic district. My grandfather, Howard Dixon, had been a man of quiet observations and loud silences. He was a master carpenter who understood that the strength of a structure wasn't in the paint on the walls, but in the integrity of the foundation. Before he died 3 years ago, he used to sit on his porch and watch my father dote on Kimberly while I mowed the lawn or fixed the back fence. He never said much, but he would often hand me a cold lemonade and tell me that a person who knows how to use her hands will never be truly hungry. I didn't realize then that he was already preparing a safety net for the granddaughter he knew would be pushed out of the nest. I met with his longtime attorney, a man named Mr. Henderson, who looked as ancient and sturdy as the oak trees lining the streets outside. He didn't offer a dramatic preamble. He simply slid a heavy manila envelope across the mahogany desk. Savanna. Your grandfather was a very cautious man. Henderson began, his voice a low southern drawl that felt like a warm blanket. He loved your father, but he didn't trust his judgment when it came to your sister. He knew Kimberly was a bottomless pit of needs, and he knew Harold would eventually try to strip the foundation to fill it. I opened the envelope and my breath hitched. Inside was the original deed to the family home in Georgia, along with a notarized codicil to Howard's will that I had never seen. The document was a tactical masterpiece, a professional-grade trap set by a man who had spent 60 years reading the grain of wood and the character of men. Grandpa Howard hadn't actually gifted the house to my father in the way Harold believed. He had granted him a life estate with a very specific ironclad contingency. The deed stated that the property title remained in a private trust managed by Howard's estate. If Harold ever attempted to sell the home, use it as collateral for a loan, or encumber the property in any way to settle the debts of Kimberly Dixon, the life estate would be immediately revoked. In that instant, the full title and ownership would transfer directly to me. I sat back in the leather chair, the weight of the paper feeling like lead in my hands. This was the truth weapon. My parents had been living in that house for 3 years under the delusion that they were the masters of their domain. They had spent the last decade treating me like a guest in my own childhood home, never realizing that they were effectively my tenants. Howard had seen the trajectory of the family long before I did. He knew that Harold's manufacturing pension wouldn't be enough to sustain Kimberly's delusions of grandeur. He knew that eventually they would look at the house as their final piggy bank. Henderson leaned forward, his eyes sharp behind his spectacles. Savanna, I received a title inquiry from a local bank yesterday. Your father attempted to open a home equity line of credit for $150,000. He told the bank he needed the funds for a family business venture, but the secondary contact on the application was Kimberly's Midtown apartment complex. He triggered the clause sweetheart. As of 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon, you are the sole owner of 412 Maple Drive. Your parents are currently living in a house they don't own, and according to the records, they haven't even been notified by the bank yet that the loan was denied because they don't hold the title. The conflict shifted from a struggle for respect to a massive imbalance of power. I was no longer just the event planner they were trying to exploit for free labor. I was their landlord. The audacity of their text message, the manipulation of the group chat, and the smear campaign Kimberly was running all felt suddenly absurdly small. They were playing checkers while Grandpa Howard had been playing championship chess from the grave. I realized that the $50,000 deposit they had wired me wasn't just their last bit of cash. It was a drop in the bucket compared to the roof over their heads that they had just gambled away. But this discovery created a harrowing new tension. If I told them now, before the anniversary party, the event would collapse. They would go into a state of absolute panic. Kimberly would likely flee with whatever remained of their dignity, and the public facade they worshipped would shatter in a way that would be messy and uncontrollable. More importantly, I wanted them to show me exactly who they were when they thought they were on top of the world. I wanted to see the full extent of the party they were building on a foundation of sand. I decided to keep the deed in my briefcase, a hidden blade I would only draw when the lights were the brightest. I thanked Mr. Henderson and walked out into the humid Savannah air. My phone buzzed. It was a message from my mother. Savannah, where are you? Kimberly is waiting at the airport and says you aren't on your flight. Don't tell me you're being difficult again. I looked at the message and felt a cold, calm sense of control. I wasn't at the airport because I had taken an earlier flight and a private car. I wanted to see the house one last time before I walked in as the owner. I had the driver take me past 412 Maple Drive. The white paint was blinding in the afternoon sun. The lawn was perfect. I saw Kimberly's SUV parked in the driveway, taking up the prime spot as always. My father was on the porch talking animatedly on his cell phone, likely trying to figure out why the bank hadn't approved his loan yet. He looked so confident, so in charge. He had no idea that the sturdy daughter he had ignored for 28 years was currently looking at his house the way a developer looks at a teardown. This new conflict was internal but visceral. Part of me felt a flicker of the old guilt, the good daughter instinct telling me to run onto the porch and warn him before the bank called with the bad news. But then I remembered the BBQ photo from my wedding day. I remembered the group chat where he discussed how much money my labor would save them so they could give it to Kimberly. The guilt died a quick, silent death. They hadn't protected me, so I didn't owe them my protection. The immediate drama now moved toward the confrontation at the house. I had the driver pull around the corner and I walked the rest of the way, my heels clicking on the pavement with a rhythmic, decisive sound. I wasn't coming home for a reunion. I was coming to inspect my property. As I rounded the hedges and stepped onto the driveway, Kimberly spotted me. She marched down the porch steps, her face twisted in a mask of manufactured outrage. "Where have you been?" she yelled loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "You were supposed to meet me at Gate B. Do you have any idea how busy I am?" I didn't stop walking. I didn't apologize. I just looked at her, then at the house, then back at her. "Kimberly," I said, my voice as level as a spirit bubbles. "You're parked in the wrong spot." I watched her eyes flash with confusion and then rage. She didn't know that was the most honest thing I had said to her in a decade. The conflict was no longer about the airport or the party. It was about the fact that every single one of them was standing on ground that had already shifted beneath their feet. I walked past her and toward the front door, knowing that the next few days were going to be the most spectacular event I had ever planned, but the guest of honor wasn't going to be my parents. It was going to be the truth. I walked into the white colonial house on Maple Drive, and the air was already thick with the scent of a manufactured storm. Kimberly was still standing in the driveway, fuming over my comment about her parking spot, but inside my parents had already begun the heavy lifting of a smear campaign designed to bury me before the first appetizer was even served. My mother was sitting at the kitchen island, her phone pressed to her ear, her voice a practiced quaver of maternal heartbreak. "I know, Janine. It is just devastating," she whispered loud enough to ensure I heard every syllable as I crossed the foyer. "We just wanted a quiet celebration of our 30 years, and Savanna is treating it like a hostile takeover. She sent us a bill for $50,000. Can you imagine charging your own flesh and blood for a dinner party?" I didn't stop to argue. I didn't even look at her. I simply walked upstairs to my old bedroom, which had long since been converted into a storage unit for Kimberly's seasonal wardrobe and failed hobby equipment, and started unpacking my laptop. The conflict wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about the Dixon family currency reputation. By the time I had my chargers plugged in, the first wave of vitriol arrived. My phone buzzed with a call from Aunt Sarah, a woman I hadn't seen since a funeral 3 years ago, and who had never once checked in during my 14 months of silence. "Savanna, how could you be so greedy?" she barked the second I answered. "Your father worked his whole life to provide for you, and now that he is retired, you are trying to bleed him dry for a party. You should be ashamed of yourself. You are turning into a cold, transactional monster." I listened to her breathe for a moment, then calmly replied that if she was so concerned about the budget, I would be happy to send her the invoice for the flowers so she could contribute. She hung up on me, but the message was clear. Patricia and Harold weren't just complaining, they were mobilizing. They were painting me as the predatory California executive, a woman who had lost her southern soul to a checkbook. This created a secondary, more dangerous conflict. In Savanna, your name is your bond, and Kimberly was busy ensuring mine was associated with extortion. She spent the evening in the living room, ostensibly helping our mother with the guest list, but actually sending frantic texts to every cousin and family friend. I watched the drama unfold through the notifications on my secondary phone. The narrative they were building was that I was forcing them into a high-end gala they didn't want, and then demanding they pay for the privilege. It was a classic Dixon flip. They had asked for spectacular, they had wired the deposit because they were desperate to hide their financial ruin, and now they were using the cost of that deception to make me the villain. But as I sat in the middle of Kimberly's discarded yoga mats and pageant sashes, the event planner in me took over. I realized that if I defended myself, I was just another daughter in a sibling spat. If I remained silent, I was the greedy monster. So I decided to change the venue of the battle. Instead of letting them control the guest list through whispered phone calls, I took the master list I had secured and moved the entire operation to a digital platform I owned and managed. I didn't just send out invitations. I sent out a professional, high-gloss digital experience that signaled this wasn't just a dinner. It was the event of the season. I changed the location from the local country club where my parents could still influence the staff to the Glass House, a premier riverfront venue that I had quietly acquired a stake in through a silent partnership 6 months ago. They didn't know I was the owner. They just saw the prestige of the name. Then I leveraged my professional connections to ensure the guest list wasn't just comprised of judgmental aunts and enabling cousins. I sent formal gold-embossed digital invites to Harold's former boss, the CEO of the manufacturing conglomerate he still desperately wanted to impress. I invited the editor of the local lifestyle magazine and the head of the Savanna Historical Society. I was raising the stakes of their public image to a level where they couldn't afford to look anything less than thrilled. The immediate tension shifted the next morning at breakfast. My father was staring at his phone, his face a mottled shade of red. "Savanna, why is Arthur Sterling calling me to tell me he is excited about the gala at the Glass House?" he demanded, slamming his coffee mug onto the granite counter. "We never agreed to that venue, and we certainly didn't agree to have the press there." I looked at him over the rim of my own cup, my expression as cool as a San Francisco morning. You asked for spectacular Mr. Dixon. If the CEO of Sterling Manufacturing is attending, you can't serve potluck in a basement. I've secured the premier venue in the city. If you want to cancel the $50,000 deposit, is as per our signed contract non-refundable. The conflict was now a deadlock of pride. Harold wanted the prestige of being seen with Arthur Sterling more than he wanted to save the money. He realized that if he canceled now, he would have to explain to the most powerful man in his professional circle why he couldn't afford a party planned by his own daughter. I was using his own vanity as a cage. Patricia was equally trapped. She had been telling the neighbors that I was being difficult, but now that the invitation list included the elite of Savanna social circles, she had to pivot. She couldn't be the victim of a greedy daughter if that daughter was currently providing her with a ticket to the highest social tier in the city. Kimberly was the only one who saw the danger. She cornered me in the hallway, her voice a sharp whisper. "You are doing this to trap them," she hissed. "You know they can't afford the final balance for a place like the Glass House. You're going to get to the end of the night and hand them a bill that will ruin them." I looked at my sister, the girl who had spent 25 years siphoning off every resource our parents had. "Kimberly, you should worry less about my bill and more about your own," I said. "I saw the notice from the bank in the mail yesterday. Your Midtown apartment down payment was declined. Is that why you're so worried about the party budget?" The look of dawning terror on her face was more satisfying than any of the vitriolic phone calls I'd received. The conflict was no longer a smear campaign against me. It was a desperate race for Kimberly to find a new source of income before our parents realized she was the one who had actually drained them dry. She realized then that by bringing the town's most prominent figures into the room, I wasn't just increasing the prestige, I was increasing the number of witnesses to their eventual collapse. As the week progressed, the tension in the house became almost unbearable. My parents were performing the role of the happy couple for the phone calls, but behind closed doors, they were frantic. They were trapped in a spectacular event they couldn't control, being billed by a daughter they couldn't manipulate, and living in a house they didn't realize they no longer owned. Every time the doorbell rang, Harold flinched, terrified it was the bank calling about the home equity loan. Every time I opened my laptop, Patricia watched me with a mixture of awe and resentment. The immediate drama now moved toward the final vendor walkthrough. I had scheduled it for the following morning, and I had insisted that Kimberly attend. I wanted her to see exactly how much a professional event costs. I wanted her to see the invoices for the lighting, the security, and the high-end catering. But more importantly, I wanted her there when I introduced the final guest I had added to the list. A man she hadn't seen in 2 years, and the one person who knew exactly where her influencer career had actually gone off the rails. The Dixon family thought they were attending an anniversary, but I was building a courtroom, and the jury was already starting to take their seats. As I walked out to my car that evening, leaving the three of them in the kitchen arguing over the seating chart, I realized that the smear campaign had failed for one simple reason. You can't ruin the reputation of a woman who no longer cares what you think, but you can certainly lose your own by trying. The glass house stood as a shimmering monument of steel and transparency against the darkening Napa Valley sky, its floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting the rolling vineyards like a high-definition mirror. This was not just a venue, it was a statement. My parents, Harold and Patricia, stepped out of their town car, expecting a quaint family gathering flavored with a bit of California luxury. What they found instead was a high-stakes social arena designed to expose the very seams of their carefully constructed reality. I had spent the last 72 hours ensuring that every floral arrangement, every amber-hued light, and every precisely placed champagne flute whispered of an excellence they had never bothered to cultivate in me. I stood near the grand entrance draped in a charcoal silk suit that cost more than Kimberly's monthly rent, holding a digital tablet that served as my shield and my weapon. When my parents approached, the air between us seemed to drop 10 degrees. Patricia reached out her arms wide for one of those performative, suffocating hugs she used to deploy for church photos, but I stepped back with the practiced grace of a seasoned executive. I extended my right hand, my grip firm and dry. Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. Dixon. I said, my voice carrying just enough professional warmth to be polite, but not an ounce of daughterly affection. Welcome to the glass house. My mother's face flickered a momentary glitch in her pageant-ready smile, especially as she noticed the local lifestyle reporter and a photographer from the regional business journal watching our exchange. They were here because I had personally invited them to cover a story about legacy and local business leadership, but they were about to witness a very different kind of heritage. Harold's jaw tightened, his eyes darting to the media presence. He had spent 40 years being the man who held court in Savanna, the patriarch whose word was law. To be greeted with a handshake in front of his former professional peers was a surgical strike to his ego. He tried to reclaim the narrative, leaning in to whisper through a forced grin. "Savanna, stop this nonsense. We are here to celebrate us. You are the host, act like a daughter." I didn't blink. I simply turned to the reporter and introduced my clients, the Dixons, before signaling a server to whisk them toward the reception area. The conflict wasn't a shouting match. It was a cold, public demonstration that the rules of the house were now my rules. I was no longer the sturdy girl who could be bullied into compliance. I was the owner of the room, and they were merely the guests of honor on a very expensive, very temporary stage. As the cocktail hour began, the tension shifted from the entrance to the guest list. I had populated the room with a specific kind of audience, people who valued transparency and merit. Arthur Sterling, Harold's former boss, was already deep in conversation with my husband Marcus, discussing the complexities of the San Francisco real estate market. When Harold tried to join the circle, he realized he was out of his depth. He couldn't talk about legacy because his own was built on a crumbling manufacturing pension and a daughter's stolen savings. He tried to pivot to Kimberly, looking around for the golden child to serve as his social anchor, but Kimberly was currently occupied with a different kind of crisis. My sister had arrived looking like an advertisement for desperation, her dress a loud emerald green silk that practically screamed for attention. She was cornering one of my high-end vendors, a florist who handled the biggest weddings in Northern California, demanding that her own bouquet be larger than the anniversary centerpieces. Kimberly didn't understand that, at an event of this caliber, loud is cheap. She was trying to dominate a space she hadn't earned, her voice rising as she realized the servers weren't prioritizing her needs. I watched her from across the room, noting the frantic way she kept checking her phone. The conflict with Kimberly was no longer about sibling rivalry. It was about her realization that the Dixon brand was no longer a blank check she could cash. The drama reached its first major peak during the transition to dinner. I had arranged for a short introductory toast to be given by Arthur Sterling. I knew Harold would expect to be the first to speak to frame the 30th anniversary as a victory of his own making. But I had scripted the evening with the precision of a court hearing. Arthur stood, his voice commanding the room's attention. He spoke of the importance of foundations, of building things that last. And then he looked directly at me. He praised my firm Porter events for the integrity and brilliance of our work. He didn't mention my parents' marriage at all. He mentioned my professional standing. I saw my mother's hand shake as she reached for her water glass. She realized then that the spotlight wasn't on her 30 years of marriage. It was on the daughter she had tried to treat as an invisible intern. Just as the first course was being served, Kimberly made her move. She had spent the last hour realizing that I had effectively neutralized her influence, so she decided to launch a nuclear strike. She marched toward the podium, her heels clacking on the polished concrete with an aggressive rhythm. She snatched the microphone from the stand before the MC could react. "I need everyone's attention," she announced, her voice slightly shrill and echoing off the glass walls. "My parents' anniversary is wonderful, but I have even more exciting news to share tonight." She looked toward a man standing near the back of the room, a boyfriend our parents had never met, and began to pull a velvet box from her clutch. The conflict reached a boiling point in that singular, agonizing moment. Kimberly was attempting to hijack her parents' 30th anniversary to announce an engagement she hoped would secure her a new financial lifeline. She was demanding the center stage, a move so tactless it made even the most seasoned socialites in the room wince. My father's face went from pale to a deep, dangerous purple. He looked at me, his eyes pleading with me to do something to stop the embarrassment. He finally realized that the golden child he had protected for 25 years was the one who was truly capable of humiliating him. He had spent weeks telling everyone I was the greedy one, the one who would ruin the party. Yet here was Kimberly, the fragile one, tearing the roof off his reputation in front of his former boss and the local press. I didn't move to stop her. I didn't have to. I had already anticipated her need for attention and had placed a specific guest in her direct line of sight. Standing right next to her intended fiancé was a man named David Vance. David was a private investigator I had hired to vet Kimberly's influencer sponsors. And he was also a former process server who had been looking for Kimberly for 3 weeks regarding a lawsuit for unpaid boutique fees in Savanna. As Kimberly opened the box to propose, David stepped forward, not with a congratulatory hug, but with a legal envelope. The photographer I had hired for the event, a man who knew exactly where to point his lens, captured the precise moment Kimberly's engagement announcement turned into a public legal summons. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the sound of Kimberly's emerald silk rustling as she froze. The conflict was no longer a private family dispute. It was a public execution of the Dixon facade. My parents sat at the head table, their 30th anniversary monument crumbling around them. They had wanted spectacular, and they had gotten it, but they hadn't realized that when you build a house of glass, everyone can see the rot in the support beams. Kimberly looked at the envelope, then at the room full of Savanna's elite, and finally at me. She saw the tablet in my hand and the calm, clinical expression on my face. She realized then that I hadn't just planned a party. I had orchestrated a confession. The immediate tension moved from the podium to the head table. My father stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He didn't look at Kimberly. He looked at me, his hands trembling with a mixture of shame and a dawning, terrifying recognition. He realized that the daughter who had been too far to travel for was the only one who truly knew the depth of the hole they had dug. He tried to speak, to offer some kind of decree that would fix the damage, but I simply checked my watch and signaled for the second course to be served. The evening was far from over. I still had the deed to their house in my briefcase, and the anniversary video was scheduled to play in 10 minutes. The glass house was about to live up to its name, and for the Dixons, the truth was about to become the only thing they had left to wear. The silence in the glass house following Kimberly's disastrous engagement attempt was thick enough to choke on, but for me it was a familiar coldness. As I watched the caterers glide through the shadows to clear the first course, my mind didn't stay in the present. It anchored itself to a damp Tuesday morning in March, during my senior year at the University of Georgia. I was 21 years old, standing at an ATM outside the student union, staring at a screen that read insufficient funds. I had spent 3 years working double shifts at a campus coffee shop and summers doing grueling data entry for a local logistics firm. I had $15,000 saved, my escape fund, my first month's rent in California, my proof that I could survive without being a Dixon. I checked the balance again, thinking it was a glitch. The account was empty. There was a single transfer for the full amount to my father's personal checking account. I drove home so fast my old sedan felt like it was going to rattle apart. I found Harold in his study, comfortably sipping a bourbon and reading a trade journal. When I confronted him, his face didn't show guilt. It showed a weary kind of annoyance. "Savanna, lower your voice," he had said, not even putting his glass down. "Your sister was in a state. Her friends were all going to Cabo for spring break, and she felt excluded. She's fragile, Savanna. She doesn't have your constitution. I borrowed that money to ensure she didn't fall into a depression. You're strong. You've always been the one who finds a way." I stood there, realizing that in my father's eyes my strength was not a virtue to be rewarded. It was an asset to be liquidated for Kimberly's comfort. He hadn't even asked. He just reached into my future and took it because he knew I was too sturdy to break. That memory is the engine that drives every decision I make now. It is the reason I don't flinch when I see my mother's mascara running in the reflection of the wine glasses. It is the reason I am standing at the technical booth right now, checking the levels on the evening's centerpiece. My parents think this tribute video is a walk down memory lane, a series of curated highlights showing 30 years of their supposed success. They expect to see photos of the white colonial house, Kimberly's cheerleading trophies, and maybe a few shots of me in the background of their beach vacations. They want the room to see the Dixon brand in its prime. They have no idea that I am about to show them the cost of that prime. The conflict in the room is shifting from Kimberly's public legal humiliation to a deeper, more structural fear. My father is trying to catch my eye from the head table, his face a mask of panic. He wants me to skip the video. He knows that once the lights go down, he loses control of the room's perception. He is leaning over to my mother, whispering urgently. I can see his hands shaking. He is likely wondering if I am going to mention the bounced check at the Savanna hotel or the denied home equity loan. He still thinks I am the sturdy daughter who might be convinced to protect him for the sake of the family name. He doesn't realize that my loyalty died the day he told me my $15,000 was less important than a spring break tan. I signal to the tech lead. The lights in the ballroom dim, and the chatter of 200 of Savannah's elite dies down to an expectant hum. I look at Arthur Sterling, who is sitting with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He represents the world my father desperately wants to stay a part of, a world of integrity, stability, and results. Harold thinks this video will solidify his place in that world. I think it will be the final audit. The conflict is no longer about whether my parents love me. It is about whether they can survive the truth of how they treated the only child who actually succeeded. Kimberly is still slumped in her chair, the legal envelope from David Vance lying on the tablecloth like a dead bird. She is staring at the screen, her emerald silk dress catching the faint glow of the projector. She is terrified, and she should be. She has spent 25 years being the beneficiary of my father's theft, never once questioning where the money for her SUV or her midtown apartment came from. She is about to see that the sturdy daughter has a very long memory and a very high-quality camera. The video doesn't start with my parents' wedding photos. It starts with a shot of the ATM screen from 7 years ago. Insufficient funds. The audience doesn't understand yet, but I can hear the sharp intake of breath from the head table. My father recognizes that screen. He knows exactly what day that was. Then the video cuts to a photo of Kimberly on a yacht in Cabo, laughing with a margarita in her hand, dated 3 days after that ATM transaction. I have laid out the timeline with the cold precision of a forensic accountant. I am showing the room the architecture of the Dixon family, one daughter's labor being used to buy another daughter's leisure. A new, sharper conflict is erupting in the darkness of the ballroom. I can hear people whispering, piecing it together. The reporter I invited is leaning forward, scribbling in her notebook. This isn't a tribute, it's a deposition. My mother is clutching her pearls so hard I'm surprised the string hasn't snapped. She is looking at me, her eyes pleading for me to stop the reel. She still thinks this is a negotiation. She doesn't understand that when you hire a professional to plan your party, you don't get to edit the footage. I am showing them the reality of the real Dixon crew. The drama reaches a visceral peak as the video transitions into the Monterey cliffside. I show the 2 empty chairs in the front row. I show the 99-cent card they sent. And then I show the barbecue photo Kimberly posted 10 minutes later. The contrast is devastating. It is the visual proof that they weren't too far away. They were just too indifferent to care. I watch the back of my father's head. He is sitting perfectly still, the way a person does when they are waiting for a blow they can't avoid. He realized then that I didn't plan this party to celebrate their 30 years. I planned it to mark the end of their influence. But as the video continues, a new conflict emerges that even I didn't fully anticipate. My mother stands up in the middle of the darkened room. "Savanna, turn it off," she screams, her voice cracking the sophisticated atmosphere like a hammer. "This is private. This is family business. How dare you do this to us? She is no longer the polished socialite. She is a wounded animal backed into a corner of her own making. The guests are frozen. This is the moment where the southern facade falls away completely, leaving nothing but the raw, ugly truth of their dysfunction. The technical lead looks at me, his hand over the kill switch. I shake my head. No, we aren't finished. I look at my mother, then at the screen where a photo of Grandpa Howard's house is now appearing. The very house they think they own. The very house they tried to gamble away yesterday. The immediate tension has moved from the past to the immediate future of their shelter. I have the deed in my hand. I have the audience's attention. And I have the resolve of a woman who was told she was strong enough to find a way. My parents are about to find out that being strong means I no longer have to be gentle. The glass house is about to become the site of their final foreclosure, and I am the one who holds the keys. The lights in the ballroom began to lift just enough for the guests to find their champagne flutes, but the atmosphere remained charged with the residue of the video. I stepped out from the technical booth, smoothing the fabric of my suit, feeling the weight of 200 pairs of eyes tracking my movement. My mother, Patricia, was already in damage control mode. She had cornered Mrs. Gable, a prominent philanthropist, whose name adorned half the hospital wings in Georgia, near a massive display of white hydrangeas. Patricia was laughing that high, brittle laugh she uses when she is terrified, her hand resting with feigned intimacy on Mrs. Gable's arm. I approached them slowly, my heels silent on the thick carpet. As I drew closer, I heard my mother's voice, honey-thick and dripping with a mother's supposed pride. "Oh, Savanna has always been our overachiever," Patricia cooed, casting a fleeting nervous glance my way as I joined the circle. "I always pushed her to be the absolute best because I knew she had this spark. I suppose you could say her success is a reflection of the high standards we set in the Dixon house. She didn't have time for toys, she was too busy becoming a CEO." Mrs. Gable smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. She was a woman who had built her own fortune in the 80s and could smell a manufactured narrative from a mile away. I waited for the perfect beat, the moment where the silence stretched just long enough to be uncomfortable. "I'm so glad you remember it that way, Mother," I said, my voice as clear and cool as a mountain stream. I didn't raise my volume, but in the hush of the cocktail hour the words carried. I suppose pushing me so hard meant making sure I learned self-reliance early. You pushed me so far, in fact, that you and Dad didn't even have time to travel to California for my wedding last year. I turned to Mrs. Gable with a small apologetic smile. "It is a sacrifice, I'm sure, to stay behind for a neighborhood barbecue when your eldest daughter is at the altar. But as Mother says, the standards in our house are very unique." The color drained from Patricia's face so quickly it was as if a plug had been pulled. Mrs. Gable's hand froze on her wine glass, her gaze shifting from my mother's horrified expression to my calm, unwavering stare. The silence that followed was visceral. It was the sound of a carefully curated image shattering in real time. My mother tried to stammer an excuse, something about the distance and her delicate nerves. But the logic of American social circles is unforgiving. In a world where these women fly across the globe for a trunk show or a spa weekend, the idea of missing a daughter's wedding due to travel distance was an absurdity that couldn't be ignored. Mrs. Gable set her glass down on a passing server's tray, her expression shifting from polite interest to a cold, judgmental distance. "How interesting," she murmured, her tone indicating that Patricia Dixon was no longer a person of consequence in her social ledger. "Excuse me, I see Arthur Sterling has arrived." The conflict moved from a private jab to a social execution. Patricia turned on me the second Mrs. Gable was out of earshot, her eyes flashing with a predatory kind of rage. "How dare you?" she hissed, her voice a jagged whisper. "You just humiliated me in front of the most important woman in this room. After everything we've done to give you this platform tonight, you choose to spit in my face." I looked at her, noting the way her Cartier bracelet caught the light, the same light that was now exposing every wrinkle of her deception. "I didn't choose the platform, Mother," I reminded her. "You hired me." And as for humiliation, I think the empty chairs in Monterey did a much better job of that than I ever could. This interaction ignited a new, more volatile tension. My father Harold had seen the exchange and was marching toward us, his face a mottled purple. He realized that I wasn't playing the role of the dutiful daughter. I was dismantling the family brand in front of his professional peers. The tutu and the trauma performance was over. They had spent 28 years telling everyone I was the sturdy one who didn't need anything, but by revealing the wedding betrayal, I had shown the room that I wasn't sturdy, I was neglected. To the elite of Savanna, neglect is the one sin that can't be covered up with a fresh coat of paint. The drama intensified as Kimberly tried to intervene, her emerald dress rustling as she pushed her way into our circle. "You're just jealous," Kimberly spat, her voice rising enough to attract more onlookers. "You're trying to ruin their night because you can't stand that people actually love me. You're pathetic, Savanna." I looked at my sister, the girl who was still clutching the legal envelope David Vance had handed her, and I felt a surge of pity that was quickly replaced by a sharp professional resolve. "Kimberly, you are literally standing in a room full of people who just watched you get served for unpaid debts," I said, my voice carrying to the surrounding guests. "If I were you, I would worry less about my jealousy and more about the fact that your father's boss is currently asking the reporter why the Dixon family is a house of cards." The immediate conflict now moved toward the head table. My father realized that he couldn't bully me into silence in this room. He had invited the press, he had invited his CEO, and he had invited the socialites he worshipped. He had built a coliseum, but he hadn't realized that I was the one holding the lion's leashes. He tried to grab my arm to lead me toward the kitchen for a private lecture, but I stepped out of his reach. "Don't touch the merchandise, Mr. Dixon," I said, the professional distance in my voice acting as a physical barrier. "We have a dinner to finish." As the guests began to take their seats for the main course, the tension in the room reached a fever pitch. The perfect family was gone, replaced by a group of people who were essentially strangers sharing a very expensive piece of real estate. I watched my parents sit at the head table, flanked by the very people they had tried to impress, and I could see the sweat on my father's brow. He knew that the anniversary video and the cocktail hour exchange were just the opening acts. He knew that I had more in my briefcase. But a new conflict was emerging from the back of the room. A man I didn't recognize, dressed in a sharp but slightly dated tuxedo, was speaking urgently with the house manager. I recognized the manager's body language. It was the stance of someone dealing with a serious security issue. I checked my tablet and realized that the guest list had been breached. Someone was here who hadn't been invited by me but likely by Kimberly in a desperate bid for a different kind of leverage. I felt a chill of anticipation. Kimberly had been busy while I was planning the decor. She had brought a ghost of her own to the feast. I looked at the head table one last time before heading toward the security team. My mother was trying to smile for a photographer, but her eyes were darting toward the door. She sensed it too. The curated image hadn't just cracked. The foundation was starting to groan under the weight of 30 years of lies. I realized then that the most dangerous conflict isn't the one you plan for. It is the one that walks through the door when you think you've already won. The Dixon 30th anniversary was about to transition from a social disaster to a full-blown wreckage, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't going to be the one to catch the falling glass. I was going to be the one to tell the story of how it broke. The immediate drama was no longer about the wedding or the tutoring. It was about the man in the tuxedo and the secret he was carrying into my ballroom. My sister thought she was playing a card, but she didn't realize that in the glass house there are no hiding places left. I didn't have time to process the mysterious man in the tuxedo because Kimberly grabbed my arm and yanked me toward the bridal suite, a plush soundproof room used for VIP adjustments. She slammed the heavy oak door behind us, her chest heaving under the emerald silk of her dress. The mask of the grieving, supportive sister was gone, replaced by a jagged, frantic hunger. I stood my ground, clutching my tablet, watching her eyes dart around the room like she was looking for a weapon. She didn't go for a physical strike. She went for the one thing she thought I still valued: my silence. "I know about the house, Savanna," she hissed, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. "I went through Dad's desk this morning before we left for the airport." I saw the bank's rejection letter and the title search from Grandpa's lawyer. I know you own the Georgia house. I know you've been sitting on that secret like a viper. I didn't flinch. I reached into my pocket and subtly pressed the record button on my secondary phone, a professional habit that had saved me in dozens of corporate disputes. I leaned back against the vanity, my expression unreadable. "And what exactly do you think that information is worth, Kimberly?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She took a step toward me, her face twisting into a sneer that looked exactly like our father's when he was closing a predatory deal. "It's worth exactly $100,000, she said. "I need the money for the Midtown apartment and to settle the debt that David Vance just handed me in front of everyone. You're going to wire it to me tonight, or I walk back out into that ballroom and tell Arthur Sterling and the local press that you stole your parents' home from under them while they were celebrating their anniversary. I'll tell them you're a fraud who uses her professional firm to bankrupt her own family." The betrayal was absolute, but it wasn't surprising. As I looked at my sister, I realized she was the true legacy of Harold Dixon. She didn't value the house as a home. She valued it as a hostage. She saw our grandfather's will not as a protector's final wish, but as a flaw in the system she could exploit. This was the boardroom version of our childhood. In her mind, everything was a transaction, and love was just the grease used to make the gears of manipulation turn faster. She really believed that I would pay her to keep a secret that was already public record. She didn't realize that the golden child was no longer the prize of the Dixon family. She was the liability that was going to sink them all. The conflict in the room was a microcosm of our entire lives. Kimberly stood there convinced of her own power while I stood there documenting her self-destruction. "You realize that by asking for this, you are committing extortion," I said, my tone clinical and detached. Kimberly laughed, a sharp, ugly sound that echoed off the velvet wallpaper. "It's not extortion if it's a family settlement, Savanna. Dad will back me up. He always does. He'd rather see you lose your firm than see me lose my reputation." I looked at her and felt a sudden profound sense of relief. The sturdy daughter was finally done carrying the weight of this relationship. I realized then that Kimberly wasn't fragile at all. She was just incredibly proficient at using her supposed fragility as a shield while she aimed for your throat. This realization ignited a new, more dangerous tension. If I gave her the money, she would never stop. If I didn't, she was going to cause a scene that would require more than just reputation management. It would require legal intervention. But I had been an event planner for the most powerful people in California for years. I knew that the best way to handle a blackmailer isn't to pay them, but to make their leverage irrelevant. I looked at the countdown on my tablet. The main course was being served in 3 minutes. The anniversary video was primed, and the man in the tuxedo was still waiting in the wings. "You think Dad will back you up?" I said, stepping closer to her until we were inches apart. "You think he'll choose the daughter who just got served with a lawsuit in front of his CEO over the daughter who currently holds the deed to the roof over his head? You really haven't been paying attention to how the world works, Kimberly. You're not the golden child anymore. You're a bad investment, and Harold Dixon doesn't keep bad investments on his books once the truth comes out." Her eyes widened, the first flicker of genuine doubt crossing her face. She tried to speak, but I held up my hand. "I'm not giving you a cent. In fact, I'm about to go back out there and finish the show. And just so we're clear on the rules of the room." I tapped the phone in my pocket. "Every word of your little demand has been recorded. If you so much as breathe a word of Grandpa's will to the press before I'm ready, this recording goes to the district attorney." The drama reached a visceral peak as Kimberly realized she had no cards left to play. She looked around the bridal suite as if the walls were closing in on her. She had spent her entire life being told she was the one who mattered, and in one 10-minute conversation, she had become the one who was expendable. The conflict moved from the money to her very survival within the family hierarchy. She knew that if I told our father about the blackmail, he would turn on her to save himself. That was the Dixon way. Loyalty only goes as far as the nearest exit sign. But the immediate tension was interrupted by a sharp knock on the door. It was Marcus, my husband. Savanna, the press is asking for a statement about the legal server, he said through the wood. And that man in the tuxedo is insisting on speaking to Harold right now. He says he represents the Savanna Bank. I looked at Kimberly. The timing was perfect. The bank was here to officially notify Harold that his loan was denied because he didn't own the house. Kimberly had tried to blackmail me for a secret that was literally walking through the front door of the gala. The absurdity of her greed made me want to laugh. She had been so focused on stealing from me that she hadn't seen the entire house of cards collapsing from the outside. I opened the door and walked past her, leaving her standing in the middle of the room in her emerald silk dress, looking like a ghost. I didn't need to destroy her. She had already done the work for me. The boardroom betrayal was complete, but the public fallout was just beginning. As I walked back into the ballroom, I saw my father standing near the bar, looking older than I had ever seen him. He was cornered by the man in the tuxedo. The guest of honor was finally meeting the reality of his financial situation. The conflict was no longer about a party or a wedding. It was about the fact that the Dixon name was currently being audited in front of the entire Napa Valley elite. I checked the video screen one last time. It was time for the final act. I realized that the golden child had been the family's greatest liability all along, not because she was weak, but because she was exactly like the man who raised her. And as the lights dimmed for the final time, I knew that none of them were going to like the ending I had planned. The drama was about to transition from a social disaster to a total foreclosure of their lives, and I was the only one who knew where the exit was. The ballroom lights didn't just dim, they vanished, plunging the 200 guests into a curated darkness that felt more like a courtroom than a celebration. I stood at the very back of the room, my thumb hovering over the final execution command on my tablet. At the head table, my father straightened his silk tie and my mother touched her hair, both of them leaning forward with the expectant, hungry smiles of people about to be worshipped on a 10-foot screen. They thought they were about to see a highlight reel of their 30-year reign over Savanna's social life. The screen flickered to life, and for the first 60 seconds, I gave them exactly what they paid for. Soft acoustic guitar music swelled as images of a younger Harold and Patricia filled the frame, their own wedding day, the purchase of the white colonial house, and carefully staged portraits of the family under the Georgia oaks. The audience began to hum with sentimental approval. But then the music didn't just fade. It stopped with a jarring digital screech that made the guests flinch. The screen went black for 3 agonizing seconds before a new image appeared. It was the Monterey cliffside. It was a wide shot of my wedding ceremony, capturing the breathtaking Pacific horizon and the row upon row of happy guests, except for the 2 prominent white ribbon chairs in the very front row. They were hauntingly vacant. I let that image hang there until the first whispers began to ripple through the Napa Valley elite. Then the screen split. On the left, the empty wedding chairs. On the right, the photo Kimberly had posted that same afternoon, my parents, standing by a smoking grill in Georgia beer bottles raised, laughing with neighbors, under the caption, "The Real Dixon Crew Together at Last." The timestamp on the barbecue photo was highlighted in a glowing neon red, matching the exact minute I had been pronounced a wife. The conflict in the room transformed from a celebration into a collective gasp of social horror. I watched Arthur Sterling lean back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he looked from the screen to the man sitting 3 seats away from him. Harold's face didn't just turn red, it went a sickly, bruised shade of gray. He tried to stand, perhaps to find the technical booth, and rip the cables out, but the video transitioned before he could find his footing. A new sound filled the speakers, not music, but the crisp, high-definition recording of the group chat I had been added to by mistake. My father's voice, amplified by the state-of-the-art sound system, echoed through the ballroom. "Savanna will do the labor for free, just to get back in our good graces. It saves us the $50,000 a professional would charge. We will spend that on Kimberly's new apartment instead." The silence that followed was so heavy, it felt like a physical weight pressing down on the guests. You could actually hear the rhythmic, nervous clicking of a server's heels on the concrete floor in the distance. The real Dixon's chat messages scrolled up the screen like a list of crimes. Kimberly's text about me being a cost-saving measure appeared in giant crisp lettering. I saw Patricia bury her face in her hands, but there was no place for her to hide. The glass house was living up to its name. Every angle of their duplicity was visible to the very people they had spent 30 years trying to impress. The reporter I had invited was no longer scribbling. She was recording the screen with her phone, her eyes wide with the realization that she was witnessing the social suicide of a dynasty. But the final blow was yet to come. The video cut to a grainy black and white still of the bridal suite where I had just been cornered. Then the audio from my secondary phone began to play. Kimberly's voice, shrill and predatory, filled the room. "I know about the house, Savanna. I know you own the Georgia house. You are going to wire me $100,000 tonight, or I walk back out there and tell everyone you stole it." I watched Kimberly, who was still slumped in her chair, look up at the screen with an expression of such pure, unadulterated terror that I almost felt a flicker of the old sisterly instinct to protect her. But the recording continued, capturing her laughter and her admission that our father would back her up because he valued her reputation over my life's work. This created a massive, insurmountable conflict for my father. He wasn't just being exposed as a bad parent, he was being exposed as a co-conspirator in a criminal extortion attempt. Arthur Sterling stood up not to help, but to leave. He didn't say a word to Harold. He simply buttoned his blazer and walked toward the exit, his departure signaling to every other businessman in the room that the Dixon name was now radioactive. The drama reached its visceral peak as my mother finally found her voice, screaming into the darkness for someone to shut it off. But the video ended on its own, fading to a simple white slide, with a quote from my grandfather's will, for the one who built the fence, not the one who merely painted it. The lights came up, but no one moved. The guests sat in their high-end chairs, staring at the head table as if they were looking at a car wreck. My father was clutching the edge of the table so hard his knuckles were white, his eyes fixed on the man in the tuxedo, the bank representative who was now walking toward him with a formal folder in his hand. The conflict had moved past hurt feelings and into the realm of total systemic collapse. Harold realized that the spectacular party he had demanded was the very engine I had used to strip him of his dignity, his social standing, and his remaining allies. He looked at me, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, but I remained at the back of the room, my arms crossed the sturdy daughter, who had finally stopped carrying the weight of his lies. Kimberly was the first to break. She grabbed her clutch and tried to run for the side exit, but she was intercepted by David Vance, the private investigator, who reminded her that she still had a legal summons to address. The immediate tension in the room was a jagged electric thing. My mother was sobbing openly now, not out of regret, but out of the realization that Mrs. Gable would never speak to her again. The golden child had become a legal liability, and the invisible daughter had become the only person in the room with any actual power. I realized then that the truth doesn't just set you free. It clears the room of anyone who doesn't belong in your future. But as the guests began to stand and murmur, a new conflict emerged. My father pushed his chair back and marched toward me, ignoring the bank representative, ignoring his sobbing wife. He wasn't sad. He was a man who had lost everything and had nothing left to lose but his temper. He reached me in the back of the room, his breath smelling of expensive scotch and desperation. "You think you've won?" He spat, his voice low and vibrating with a terrifying intensity. "You think you can just take our home and humiliate us and walk away? I'll tie you up in court for 10 years, Savanna. I'll tell the world you forged that will. I'll make sure your firm never gets another contract in this country." I looked at him, and for the first time in 28 years, I didn't feel a single spark of fear. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the original notarized deed and the certified letter from the bank. "Mr. Dixon, you can't tie me up in court for a house you never legally owned to begin with," I said, my voice carrying to the guests who were lingering to watch the fallout. And as for my firm look around, the only people leaving this room are the ones who are glad they aren't you. I handed him the folder, the final period at the end of our relationship. The immediate drama was no longer about the party. It was about the fact that he was currently standing in a venue he couldn't pay for, defending a life he hadn't earned. I turned to Marcus, who was waiting by the door, and I realized that the spectacular dinner was over, but the reckoning was just getting started. The glass house had done its job. It had shown everyone exactly what was inside. The silence that followed the tribute video was not peaceful. It was a vacuum, a hollow space waiting to be filled by the final collapse of a 30-year deception. Harold didn't just stand up. He lurched forward, his heavy chair screeching against the polished floor like a dying animal. His face was a terrifying shade of crimson, the veins in his neck bulging as he attempted to summon the patriarchal authority that had ruled our lives since I was a child. He didn't look like a celebrating father. He looked like a man watching his empire burn and realizing he was the one who had left the stove on. He pointed a trembling finger at me, his voice booming across the glass walls of the ballroom, cutting through the murmurs of the stunned guests. "You are a vicious, ungrateful child," he roared, his words dripping with a venom that made the socialites in the front row recoil. "We gave you everything. We fed you, we clothed you, and we raised you in a house that many would kill for. To use this night, our night, to air your petty grievances and play these twisted games is a betrayal I never thought possible." I didn't flinch. I didn't step back from the podium. I stood there perfectly still, my posture a stark contrast to his unhinged aggression. I waited for the echoes of his rage to die down, letting the silence do the heavy lifting. The guests were leaning in now, their discomfort replaced by a morbid American fascination with the fall of a prominent family. Arthur Sterling was standing by the exit, his hand on the door, but he paused to look back. He was a man who understood power, and he recognized that the person holding it in this room was no longer the man in the expensive suit at the head table. I looked at my father, and then I looked at the man in the tuxedo, the bank representative who was now standing just behind Harold, holding the legal folder like a grim reaper. "I don't play games, Mr. Dixon," I said, my voice amplified by the microphone, steady and devoid of the heat he was projecting. "I am an event planner. I deal in logistics contracts and the cold, hard reality of what people actually build. You speak of the house on Maple Drive as if it is your fortress, but you forgot to check the foundation." I reached into the leather portfolio on the lectern and pulled out a single embossed sheet of paper. I held it up so the cameras and the guests could see the official gold seal of the Savanna Clerk of Courts. "This is a certified copy of Grandpa Howard's deed. My grandfather was a man who believed in protecting what he built from people who only know how to spend. He knew that one day your inability to say no to Kimberly would lead you to gamble with the roof over your head." The conflict shifted from a daughter's resentment to a catastrophic legal reality. The guests were whispering now, the word deed passing from table to table like a contagion. Harold tried to speak, to yell over me, but I didn't give him the floor. Grandpa's will was very specific. I continued, my gaze locked on my mother, who was currently staring at me with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. It granted a life estate on the condition that the property never be encumbered for the benefit of Kimberly's debts. "Yesterday at 11:15 in the morning, you walked into a bank in Savanna and attempted to use that house as collateral for a $150,000 loan to settle Kimberly's Midtown apartment arrears and her legal fees. In that moment, by your own hand, the life estate was revoked." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Patricia let out a strangled sob, her hand flying to her mouth. Harold looked at the man in the tuxedo, who nodded once very slowly and stepped forward to hand Harold the official notice of title transfer. The drama reached its visceral peak as the realization hit the room: the Dixons were no longer the owners of the white colonial house. They were effectively homeless, and they had been stripped of their status in front of every person whose opinion they valued. "Because of your actions yesterday," I said, my voice echoing through the steel beams of the glass house, "the property title transferred directly to me. As of this moment, 412 Maple Drive belongs to Porter Events. You aren't the hosts of this anniversary. You are guests in a venue you can't afford, living in a house that I own." This revelation created an immediate systemic collapse. The social hierarchy of the room dissolved in an instant. The guests weren't looking at the Dixons with pity. They were looking at them with the detached judgment of people who don't associate with the financially ruined. Kimberly stood up, her emerald dress looking like a costume from a play that had just been cancelled. "You can't do this!" she screamed, her voice shrill and breaking. "It's our home! You're just a bitter, jealous sister trying to steal our childhood." I looked at her, noting the way she was still clutching her clutch, as if it held her last shred of dignity. "Kimberly, I didn't steal anything. I just stopped being the person who paid for your mistakes. You and Dad signed those papers yourselves. You were so busy trying to figure out how to squeeze more money out of me for your apartment that you didn't bother to read the contract our grandfather wrote to protect us." The conflict moved from the legal to the existential. Harold looked at the guests, at the press, at the CEO of Sterling Manufacturing, and he realized that the real Dixon brand was dead. He had spent his entire life molding a facade of Southern prosperity, and his sturdy daughter had just dismantled it in front of the very people he had tried to impress. He didn't look like a boss anymore. He looked like a tenant who had just been served an eviction notice. He tried to summon one last bit of defiance, his chest puffing out, but the air seemed to leave him all at once. He slumped back into his chair, the weight of the bank documents in his hand appearing to be too heavy for him to hold. But a new, sharper tension was emerging. The media members were now moving toward the head table, their cameras flashing. This wasn't just a family feud. It was a front-page story about the fall of a local manufacturing legend and the rise of a self-made titan. I signaled for the security team to begin ushering the guests toward the valet. The party was over, but the reckoning was far from finished. My mother grabbed my arm as I tried to step down from the podium, her fingers digging into my silk sleeve. "Savanna, please!" she whimpered, her face a mess of ruined makeup. "Where are we supposed to go? You can't just throw us out. We're your parents." I looked down at her hand, and then back at her eyes. "I am a professional mother." I said, the cold clarity of my new position settled deep in my bones. "I've arranged for a suite at a local motel for the next 48 hours. My assistant has already sent the address to your phone. After that, you'll need to make your own arrangements. I'm sure Kimberly has plenty of ideas on how to survive without a trust fund." I pulled my arm away, feeling the final tether of the Dixon family obligation snap. The immediate drama shifted from the ballroom to the aftermath. I had the deed, I had the recording of the blackmail, and I had the absolute silence of a room that finally understood the cost of a lie. The final surprise of the section was not the deed itself, but the way Harold responded. He didn't cry. He didn't beg. He looked at Kimberly, his golden child, and I saw a flicker of genuine resentment cross his face. He realized that the daughter he had sacrificed everything for was the reason he was now sitting in a room full of people who were laughing at him behind their hands. He reached out and pushed her hand away when she tried to comfort him. The Dixon circle had finally broken, and for the first time in 28 years, they were all standing alone. I walked toward Marcus, who was waiting at the edge of the light, and I realized that the house on Maple Drive wasn't a home anymore. It was just a piece of property. And I knew exactly what I was going to do with it. The glass house was empty now, the reflections of the vineyards dark and still, and as the last car pulled away, I realized that the only person who was actually going home tonight was me. The ballroom of the glass house was beginning to feel less like a gala, and more like a crime scene, where the only thing killed was a family's pride. As the last of the catering staff retreated into the shadows, the silence that rushed in was deafening. My mother, Patricia, didn't just sit down. She collapsed. Her legs seemed to give way, as if the very bones of her southern pedigree had turned to dust. She slumped into one of the gold-trimmed chairs at the head table, her hand grazing a centerpiece of white orchids that I had paid for with the money they tried to steal. She looked at the empty ballroom, then at the man in the tuxedo holding the foreclosure papers, and finally at Kimberly, who was currently trying to hide her face behind her sequined clutch. I saw the moment the light of delusion died in my mother's eyes. She finally realized that by spending 30 years chasing the approval and the artificial shine of the golden child, she had systematically alienated the only person in this room who actually had the power to save them. The conflict moved from a public execution to a raw domestic reckoning. Patricia reached out toward me, her fingers trembling, but she didn't have the courage to touch my sleeve this time. "Savanna," she whispered, her voice a thin, ragged thread. "We didn't mean for it to go this far. We just wanted things to be equal. We thought you were so strong that you didn't need the help. We thought Kimberly needed us more." I looked at her, and for the first time, I didn't feel the familiar heat of anger. I felt a cold clinical pity. The equality she spoke of was a myth. They hadn't tried to make things equal. They had tried to make me invisible so that Kimberly could be the only thing they saw. They had traded a daughter's heart for a sister's vanity, and now the bill had finally come due. My father, Harold, was standing a few feet away, looking like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. The red rage that had colored his face during his patriarchal outburst had faded into a sickly grayish pallor. He looked at the bank representative, then at Arthur Sterling's empty chair, and finally at the deed in his hand. He took a step toward me, his voice cracking the practiced authority of the manufacturing boss, replaced by the desperate plea of a man who had lost his compass. "Savanna." "I am sorry," he said, the words sounding foreign and clumsy in his mouth. "I made a mistake with the loan. I was just trying to keep the family together. We can fix this. We can go back to Savanna and sit down and work this out like a family." He reached for my hand, his eyes wet with a sudden opportunistic regret. I stepped back before he could make contact, the professional mask I had worn all night hardening into a permanent shield. "Stop," I said, the word cutting through his apology like a blade through silk. "Don't use the word family to try and bypass the consequences of your choices. You didn't care about keeping the family together when you drained my savings for a spring break trip. You didn't care about the family when you discussed using my labor as a cost-saving measure in a group chat you thought I couldn't see. And you certainly didn't care about the family when you decided that your oldest daughter's wedding was too far to travel for a 3-hour flight." The drama reached its visceral peak as Harold stood there, his mouth opening and closing, the apologies dying on his tongue. He realized that the sturdy daughter had finally reached her breaking point, and there was no amount of Southern charm that could bridge the gap he had created. I leaned in, my voice quiet, but carrying the weight of a decade of silence. "You said my wedding was too far to travel, Dad. You sent a card and went to a barbecue because you didn't think I was worth the effort of a plane ticket. Well, I have learned a lot about distance in the last 14 months. And the truth is, your daughter's life is now too far for you to reach. You aren't losing a house tonight. You are losing the person who would have cared for you when that house eventually fell down." This revelation created an immediate, agonizing shift in the room's tension. Patricia let out a low, keening sound, the sound of a woman realizing she had gambled her retirement on a daughter who was currently looking for the nearest exit. Kimberly didn't offer a word of comfort to our parents. She was too busy checking her reflection in the glass, likely already calculating which of her few remaining friends might let her sleep on a couch. The golden child was showing her true colors in the dark. She was a passenger who jumped ship the moment she saw the first leak. My parents were finally seeing the reality of the dynamic they had fostered. They had raised one daughter to be a pillar and the other to be a parasite, and now they were surprised that the parasite had no strength to hold them up. I reached into my blazer pocket and pulled out 2 small white cards and a printed sheet of paper. I set them on the table next to the half-eaten anniversary cake. "I am a professional," I said, my tone shifting back to the clinical distance of an event planner closing out a difficult account. "I don't leave my clients without resources. Here is a list of local Georgia shelters and low-income housing advocates in the Savannah area. And this is the business card for a therapist who specializes in family narcissism and financial recovery. I've paid for your first 3 sessions. I suggest you use them before you try to contact me again." The conflict was now a total irrevocable severance. My father looked at the list of shelters, his hand shaking so hard the paper rattled. The man who had been a manufacturing legend, the man who had bragged about his status to every person in the county, was being handed a directory for the homeless by the daughter he had tried to exploit. It was a humiliating, realistic payoff for a lifetime of arrogance. He looked at me, a flicker of the old Harold Dixon, trying to find a way to bluster his way out, but then he looked at the security guards I had stationed at the doors. He realized that the show was over. The glass house was closing, and he didn't have a key to anywhere else. The immediate tension moved to Kimberly. She finally spoke, her voice sharp with a last-ditch effort at manipulation. "You think you're so much better than us, don't you, Savanna? You think because you have the money and the firm that you can just play God with our lives." I looked at my sister, the emerald green of her dress now looking cheap and tattered in the bright cleaning lights of the ballroom. "Kimberly, I don't think I'm better than you," I said. "I just think I'm done with you. You spent 25 years being the real Dixon. I hope the title was worth the price you're about to pay for it." I turned away from them, walking toward the grand entrance where Marcus was waiting with our coats. I didn't look back to see my mother weeping into her silk napkins, or my father staring at the foreclosure notice. I had given them exactly what they asked for, a spectacular evening that everyone in Savannah would be talking about for the next decade. The problem was, I had also given them the truth, and the truth is the only thing a house of cards can't survive. As we stepped out into the cool lavender air of the Napa Valley night, the drama didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a completion. I had spent my whole life trying to get them to see me, and tonight I had finally forced them to look. But as I settled into the car, a final jarring conflict flickered in my mind. I still owned the house on Maple Drive. I had the deed, the keys, and the power. But the house wasn't the ending. The ending was what I was going to do with the land. I looked at Marcus and realized that the sturdy daughter didn't need a colonial house in Georgia to feel significant. I had built my own home one board at a time, and it was 3,000 miles away from their expectations. The immediate drama was over, but the final surprise was still waiting in my briefcase, a plan that would ensure the Dixon legacy was erased from the soil of Georgia forever. I closed my eyes as the car pulled away, leaving the lights of the glass house behind, ready for the final chapter of a story that began with an empty chair and ended with a full heart. I stepped out of the shimmering cage of the glass house and into the cool, salt-tinged air of the Napa night. But the story of the Dixon family didn't end at the valet stand. 3 weeks later, I found myself back in Georgia, standing on the sidewalk of Maple Drive one last time. I wasn't there to move in, and I certainly wasn't there to reconcile. My parents had already vacated the premises, moving into a cramped 2-bedroom rental on the outskirts of town that Kimberly had found using the last of their emergency savings. I watched from across the street as a professional crew began removing the heavy, dark furniture that had once defined my childhood. The white colonial house looked smaller than I remembered, stripped of the manufactured prestige that Harold and Patricia had worked so hard to maintain. The final conflict wasn't about who owned the bricks and mortar. It was about what those bricks represented. My parents had spent 30 years using that house as a monument to their own status and a playground for Kimberly's whims. They assumed that by taking the title, I was simply looking for a new way to hold them under my thumb, to become the very thing I had escaped. They expected me to move in to lord my ownership over them, or to sell it and pocket the profit as a final act of greed. They didn't understand that for a woman who has built her own empire from the ground up, a house built on neglect is not a prize. It is a burden. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the final set of documents I had prepared with Mr. Henderson. I wasn't keeping the house. I had already signed the deed over to the Howard Dixon Legacy Foundation, a local organization I had established in my grandfather's name. I had partnered with the very foster care agency that had protected my husband Marcus when he was a child, the same agency that had given him the stability my own blood relatives had denied me. The white colonial house was going to be converted into a transitional home for aging out foster youth, young adults who, like me, were sturdy enough to survive but deserved a foundation that wouldn't crumble under their feet. The drama reached its ultimate surprising payoff when my father showed up at the house one last time, hoping to catch me and beg for a share of the sale proceeds. He saw the sign being hammered into the pristine lawn, future home of the Howard Dixon Youth Center. He stood there, his shoulders slumped, his face a mask of confusion. "You're just giving it away?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper against the sound of the hammers. "You're giving away the Dixon legacy to strangers." I looked at him, and for the first time, I felt a sense of complete, unburdened peace. "It's not a gift to strangers, Dad," I said. "It's a gift to the people who actually know what it means to work for a future. Grandpa Howard would have hated what you did to this house, but he would have loved what it's about to become." This realization created a final internal shift. I realized that the greatest victory wasn't the public humiliation at the gala or the legal takeover of their assets. It was the fact that I no longer needed their house to feel whole. I had used their attempt to exploit me as the catalyst to do something truly meaningful. Harold walked away, then his footsteps heavy and slow, heading back to a life where he was no longer the boss, no longer the patriarch, and no longer the owner of anything but his own regret. Kimberly was nowhere to be seen. The gossip at the local diner was that she had moved to Atlanta to try and reinvent herself again, though, without a down payment or a sturdy sister to lean on. The odds were not in her favor. The immediate tension of the Dixon drama dissolved into the quiet reality of a self-made life. I flew back to California that evening, leaving the humid shadows of Savanna behind for good. A week later, Marcus and I were back in our home in Monterey, the same city where those 2 chairs had sat empty 14 months ago. We were setting the table for a small dinner party, not a spectacular gala for 200 strangers, but a meal for the people who actually showed up. We had invited the catering manager who had helped me with the Napa event, the mentor who had hired me for my first internship, and a close friend from my college years, who had once shared her lunch with me when my father forgot to send my allowance. As I laid out the napkins, I realized I was counting 4 plates. There were only 4 of us tonight, but the table felt more crowded with love than the 30th anniversary ever had. I looked at the chairs, sturdy and well-made, and I didn't see absence. I saw presence. I saw the choice we make every single day to be family to the people who earn that title. In American society, we are often told that blood is thicker than water, that you have to endure the toxicity of your relatives because they are the only people who will ever truly know you. But as I sat down to eat with people who respected my time, valued my talent, and loved me without an invoice attached, I knew that was a lie. Family is not a blood-bound obligation. It is a choice. It is the person who flies across the country for your wedding. It is the grandfather who leaves a secret deed because he knows you're the only one who can handle the truth. And it is the husband who stands by your side while you dismantle a legacy of lies to build something that actually helps the world. The Dixon Empire had collapsed, but in its place I had built a life that didn't require a facade. The final shot of my story isn't a gala or a mansion. It is me, Savanna Porter, standing on my own balcony overlooking the Pacific, holding a glass of wine and watching the fog roll in. I am 32 years old. I own a thriving business, a home filled with laughter, and the peace of knowing that I am no longer anyone's dirty secret. My name is Savanna, and I finally stopped waiting for them to see me. I started looking at myself instead, and I liked what I saw. That is my story. It's a story about a wedding that was too far to travel for an anniversary that was too expensive to survive, and a daughter who was too strong to be broken. If you have ever been the one who was overlooked, the one who was told to be sturdy while everyone else got to be fragile, I want you to know something. Their refusal to see your value doesn't lower your price, it just means they can't afford you. I have one final question for you. If you were standing at that podium in the glass house with the deed in one hand and the microphone in the other, would you have given that house away? Or would you have kept it just to remind them of what they lost? Drop your answer in the comments below. I read every single one because your stories of resilience are the foundation of this community. Thank you for listening to Hazel Tells Stories. Make sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss our next reckoning. Until then, remember that you are the architect of your own life. Build it well. The dust has finally settled on the Dixon family legacy, and for the first time in my life, the air is clear. Standing on the sidewalk of Maple Drive one last time, I watched the sign for the Howard Dixon Youth Center being anchored into the red Georgia clay. My parents expected me to keep this house out of spite, to move in and flaunt my ownership until they withered away in regret. They didn't realize that for someone who built her own life 3,000 miles away, this house wasn't a trophy, it was a tombstone for a childhood I no longer needed to mourn. By signing it over to the foster care foundation that once shielded my husband, I didn't just settle a score. I repurposed a place of neglect into a sanctuary of hope. As I walked away, leaving the keys with the director, I felt the final tether of the Dixon Golden Child dynamic snap. My father is in a rental he can barely afford. My mother is mourning a social status that was never real, and Kimberly is learning that an emerald dress can't buy a future. I didn't destroy them. I simply stopped subsidizing their delusions. Looking back at this journey from the empty chairs in Monterey to the crowded table in my own home, I've walked away with 5 hard-won lessons that I'll carry forever. First, strength is not an invitation for exploitation. Just because you are sturdy and capable of handling life's storms doesn't give anyone, especially family, the right to use your resilience as a safety net for their own laziness. Second, silence is a boundary, not a weakness. The 14 months I spent in no contact weren't about pouting. They were about building a life so solid that when the storm finally returned, it couldn't even shake the front door. Third, loyalty must be earned, not demanded by blood. A generic card and a skipped wedding are choices. If someone chooses to be absent during your milestones, you are under no obligation to be present for their emergencies. Fourth, the truth is the ultimate auditor. My parents spent 30 years painting a facade of Southern perfection, but the truth doesn't care about aesthetics. When you live a lie, you are always just one tribute video away from total foreclosure. Finally, family is a choice you make every single day. The 4 plates at my table in Monterey represent more love and loyalty than 30 years in the white colonial house ever did. Surround yourself with people who would never dream of asking you to be small just so they can feel big. My name is Savanna, and I am finally irrevocably free. I stopped waiting for my parents to see my value and started charging them for the view. If this story spoke to the part of you that has always been told to just understand, while others get to be selfish, I want you to know that your value is non-negotiable. Thank you for walking this path with me on Hazel Tells Stories. If Savanna's journey resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe. It tells the algorithm that stories of resilience and real-world justice matter. Before you go, I want to know, what is the one thing you've done for yourself that made you realize you didn't need your family's permission to be happy? I'll be in the comments reading every single word. Until next time, keep building your own table.